Every year, thousands of people go missing around the world, and more often than not, a lot of them have either not been found or have been found in what state they were. But there are some cases where people have gone missing for years and even decades, and somehow turn up with some mysterious explanation for their disappearance. In today's video, we've lined up 15 missing people who were eventually found. Edgar Lachalip. The case of Edgar Lachalip is peculiar in that the Canadian native solved his own missing persons case after 30 years of not remembering who he was. At the age of 52, he was living in a group home for 30 years with no memory of where he was born, how he'd grown up, or even if he had any immediate family. Edgar had a psychological issue in that he was diagnosed with the mental age of a 12-year-old and was found near Niagara Falls at the age of 21, having no recollection of who he was or even what his own name was. He would go on to spend the next 30 years of his life living in several group homes until one fateful day he suddenly began having flashbacks of memories and remembered his name. With the help of a social worker, he was able to retrace his origins, and as it turned out, he was from Kitchener, Canada, just 80 miles away from where he had been currently living. As it so happened, Edgar was an unstable young man, and at the age of 21, he fled from a mental institution where he had been receiving treatment in September of 1986. He then boarded a bus to Niagara Falls intending to take his own life. But upon reaching the falls, he suffered a head injury which would lead to a severe case of amnesia. With no remembrance of who he was or where he was from, Edgar then settled in the Niagara area for the next 30 years. His family believed that he had gone through with his plan and was presumed dead, but it turned out that he only had an injury but couldn't have very good memory. When his memories did return at the age of 52, a mock-up of Edgar was put on television, and surprisingly, his family recognized him straight away. They contacted the Niagara Police Department, and Edgar would then be reunited with them. Sylva Wilson, Edgar's mother, describes how she felt overwhelmed upon seeing her son after so many years of simply assuming that he had been abused because of his disorder and was possibly dead. Lucy Ann Johnson. Lucy Johnson had a rather strange life. She was married to her husband and they had an 8-year-old daughter named Linda. One fateful day in 1961, Lucy went missing from her home in Surrey, Canada, but for some odd reason, a missing persons report wasn't filed until much later in the year 1964, 3 years after her initial disappearance. The case would be treated as a homicide in which her husband was the prime suspect, as he was fully aware that his wife was missing but failed to fill out a report on time. A statewide search then began, even going as far as excavating the backyard, suspecting that the husband had killed and buried his wife, but nothing was ever found. Days would turn into weeks, and weeks turned into years, and years then became decades with no word on what had happened to Lucy Johnson. It wasn't until 2012, when the police would highlight the case as a cold case, that her daughter Linda, who was 60 years old at the time, decided to give the search for her mother one last try. She placed a missing persons ad in several newspapers all throughout British Columbia and the Yukon, where her missing mother had ties. Everyone was shocked when a woman reached out to the police, claiming to be Lucy's daughter, and stating that Lucy was alive and well and living in the Yukon. Linda then headed straight for the Yukon, and even after 52 years, she recognized her mother at first glance. Lucy had apparently run away all those years ago because her husband was abusive and would not let her take her daughter and brother with her as she left. She later settled in the Yukon and had a new family altogether. She hadn't realized that she was a missing person and that so much effort had been put into locating her, or else she would have spoken up all those years. Linda still did have some questions, like why her mother never came back for her and her brother at some point in those years, but she was happy to know that she was alive and well, and now she has a whole new family to relate to as well. Carlos Sanchez. Most people wish that they could leave their depressing jobs and just never return, and while most people never actually do it, Carlos Sanchez did, and even took it a step further. Sanchez was a medical doctor in Seville, Spain, and had been battling severe depression early in his career. Soon enough, the 26-year-old would vanish from his hometown without a trace in 1996. A missing persons report was filed and a widespread search ensued, but Carlos would never be located. He was officially declared dead 15 years later in 2010. It would not be until sometime in 2015 when two mushroom pickers encountered a man living in isolation in a forest in Tuscany. The strange man identified himself as Carlos Sanchez and even showed them his passport, telling them that he had been living alone in the forest for over 20 years. Locals would confirm that they had been seeing a strange man living alone in the forest all that time. The mushroom pickers contacted a missing person charity that was able to locate Carlos's parents, who then flew down to Tuscany a few days afterwards when they received the news that their son was alive. But Carlos had simply moved on, stating that he did not want to be found. His parents would say that they respected their son's wishes but would continue searching for him, if only to see that he was okay and give him one last embrace. Nguyen Thi Van. Sometimes parents take the discipline of their child too far and end up regretting it. Such was the case of Nguyen Thi Van and her mother, who lived in northern Vietnam in 1992. She was just 16 years old at the time and came home late on a fateful night, and as a punishment, her mother locked her outside of the house. She was rebellious and did not stick around to be let back in. Instead, she went out to have fun at a karaoke bar with a group of friends. She would meet a woman at the bar who at first would seem very friendly, but later had slipped something into her drink and then trafficked her and her friends. They were transported to China, where they were forced to marry old men, as old as 70 years old to even 80 years old, and over the next 21 years, while her mother still searched for the missing daughter, she was made to be a housewife in a forced marriage. Thankfully, she was able to escape with the help of a truck driver and finally made her way back to Vietnam. Her mother, who already believed her daughter was dead, was full of joy when she came home and overcome with regret as well for locking her outside of the house in the first place. Steve Carter. Steve Carter always knew that he was adopted, as his parents never hid the fact from him, but he still had questions about his childhood. For instance, why was the year of birth on his birth certificate a year after his actual birthday? Who were his parents, and why did they give him up for adoption? After reading about the story of Carolina White, a woman from Atlanta who discovered that she was stolen from a hospital as a baby, Carter decided that he would try to find his roots as well. A brief internet search would lead him to missingkids.com, a website where missing children who had not been found were listed. After scrolling through some pictures, he soon found a picture of a baby named Marks Panama Barnes and an artist's rendition of what that child might look like as an adult, and he realized that it was him. He discovered that he's actually born in Hawaii, but was declared missing when he was just 6 months old alongside his mother, Charlotte Moriarty. It turns out that his birth mother had mental issues and would go missing for days on end when he was born, but on that particular occasion she never came home. His father, Mark Barnes, then filed a missing persons report for his girlfriend and 6-month-old baby, and it all happened in June of 1977, and according to Mark Barnes, he never knew what happened to them for over 40 years. With a little investigation, he found out that his mother ran away with him as a baby, assuming fake names and dates of birth for the both of them. She would soon be reprimanded to a psychiatric hospital, and the baby was then put into protective care. His mother then disappeared for a few days later and was never seen again, and this would lead him to being put into an orphanage only 30 miles from where his father had been searching for him the whole time. He would be adopted 3 years later by his adoptive parents under the fake date of birth and name. Steve was then reunited with his father, now in his 60s, with DNA testing confirming their relationship. Missing woman unknowingly joins the search for herself. An unidentified woman would be reported missing during an Icelandic tour, which would lead to a strange turn of events. According to authorities, a woman who was described as Asian, 160 centimeters in height, in dark clothing, and who spoke good English, was reported missing near a volcanic canyon in southern Iceland. Other members of the tour reportedly could not find the woman, and as such, a police-sanctioned search resumed to search for the unidentified tourist. According to fellow tourists, the woman got off of the tour bus but never returned when it was time to leave. And as it so happened, she merely had a change of clothing at a bus stop, and when she returned, the other tourists on the bus actually didn't recognize her. When the description of the missing woman was passed around, the lady failed to realize that it was actually of her, and then she proceeded to join in on the search for her own self. The search involved over 50 people, some of which were on foot and others who were in vehicles, and a helicopter that was also on standby ready to assist. Searching efforts would last for almost 2 days before it occurred to the lady that she actually fit the description of the person they were looking for. She immediately reported herself to the police, as she was in fact Asian, 160 centimeters tall, and spoke good English, but had merely changed her clothing from dark to colored at the last bus stop. The search would be called off in what turned out to be a comedic end to a very strange weekend. William Burgess Powell. In 2004, a man was discovered behind a Burger King covered in fire ants laying beside the restaurant's dumpster in Richmond Hills, Georgia. The police were notified and the man was taken to the hospital, but after waking up was unable to remember his name. As such, he was assigned the name Burger King Doe, or BK Doe for short. According to doctors, it appears that BK Doe had suffered some level of amnesia, but what was strange was that they couldn't find any injuries to his head, and the amnesia was probably induced through some other traumatic event. The unidentified man could only remember a few things about his previous life, such as his birthday being August 29th of 1948, that he had 3 brothers, and he believed that he lived in Denver, Colorado. After years of being unable to identify himself, he adopted the name of Benjamin Kyle, and with the help of some friends, he was featured on several national television programs. He was even listed on the FBI's missing persons page and was the first person to ever be listed whose location was known. He was also featured on an episode of Dr. Phil, and although that episode had over 4 million viewers, none of them could identify who he was. It was after 12 years in 2016 that a genealogist was able to match his DNA to a name, William Burgess Powell. Powell had disappeared from his home in Lafayette, Indiana sometime in 1976, but although his identity had now been solved, there was still a huge question left unanswered. Between when he went missing in 76 and when he would be discovered in 2004, there are no records of him working or even living anywhere within those 28 years. Some people theorize that perhaps he was kidnapped and put into some sort of experiment, or was possibly roaming homeless all of those years. He has now been assigned a new Social Security number, as no records exist of him ever having one in the first place. J.C. Dugard. The unfortunate case of J.C. Dugard was one of the most prominent cases of child abduction in the United States. 11-year-old J.C. would be abducted outside of her home in 1991 by a man named Philip Garrido. She would be held captive by Garrido and his wife in a small shack behind their house. This would be her fate for the next 18 years, as she was repeatedly abused and completely cut off from the rest of the world. During her period in captivity, she gave birth to 2 daughters and developed a severe case of Stockholm Syndrome, in which she felt indebted to her captors. But it so happened that in 2009, when Garrido visited UC Berkeley with his 2 daughters, which he had fathered with Dugard, campus officials found his demeanor pretty strange. They then alerted the Berkeley police, and he was detained and questioned. Dugard, who was present during the questioning, initially lied, stating that she was his cousin, but upon pressing the matter, it would be revealed that she was actually a captive, and the case was blown wide open. Garrido and his wife were arrested and sent to prison, and Dugard struggled with therapy for years to rid herself of the feelings of sympathy for the couple who had subjected her to 18 years of torture in captivity. Winston Bright. The curious case of Winston Bright began when he disappeared in 1990, leaving behind his wife Leslie. A statewide search began for Bright, and his wife continuously visited local news stations to maintain the broadcast of her missing husband. After years of searching with no indication, he was then declared legally dead in 2001. Winston Bright would be declared dead, and his wife was able to collect his pension and care for their children. Everything would take a strange turn when 20 years later, a man revealed that he was in fact Winston Bright. According to him, he had amnesia in 1990 and wound up in California, where he took on a new name and a new identity. But he alleged that his memories began to return, and he was back to set the record straight, stating that he was in fact Winston Bright and that he wasn't dead. DNA testing would confirm that he was Winston Bright, But his wife was not happy that the major reason he came back was to claim his pension, which she had been collecting for the past 10 years. Many people, including his wife, didn't believe his amnesia story, but all in all, they were glad that he was alive and well. Chioma Gray. Sometimes children who are abducted have no idea that they were abducted because their captors are either estranged family or friends, or strangers who groom them into accepting their current situation. This was the case of Chioma Gray, who at the age of 15 would be abducted in 2007. Chioma was abducted from her home by a 20-year-old man named Andrew Joshua Tafoya. Tafoya took her down to Mexico and somehow brainwashed her into marrying him. The search for Chioma would go on for years until her parents hired a private investigator who then traced the stolen car that they had been driving all the way down to Mexico. The pair would be found living and working in a resort in Acapulco and returned to tell her parents that she didn't appear to be a captive, but was living there of her own free will. After a lot of intervention, Chioma was then returned to her family in 2011, and the police manhunt for Tafoya began. Tafoya was eventually arrested in 2012 and pled guilty to 2 charges of concealing a minor and would be sentenced to 2 years in prison. But it turned out that Chioma's Stockholm Syndrome was pretty severe, and during sentencing, she referred to him as her husband and begged the judge for leniency. A few months after Tafoya's sentencing, she then moved in with his parents, and although Tafoya would be released sometime in 2014, it remains unclear if the two had later returned to their disturbing dynamic or if Chioma's parents had intervened. Harrison O'Keene. Some stories would have you to believe in miracles, and the story of Harrison O'Keene is one of them. Harrison O'Keene was working as a chef on a tugboat off the Nigerian coast in 2013, and the boat had a total of 12 crew members on board and was put out to the open sea stabilizing an oil tanker. In the early hours of the morning, an ocean swell came out of nowhere, slamming into the tugboat and immediately capsized it, sinking it to the bottom of the ocean. Unfortunately, not one single member of the crew made it out of the boat alive, and they were all presumed dead. 3 days later, a diving crew was set out to retrieve the bodies of the crew members from the shipwreck nearly 60 hours after the boat had gone down. One of the divers was swimming through the corridors of the boat when a set of fingers grabbed him out of nowhere. As it turned out, it was the chef, Harrison O'Keene, who was somehow still alive 60 hours after the boat had capsized. According to him, he had found himself in a small pocket of air when the boat sank and was able to stay calm and survive with no food or water and with little oxygen, running out for nearly 60 hours. The crew fitted him with a special suit and began his slow ascent back to the ocean's surface. O'Keene had spent 2 days in a decompression chamber to free himself of nitrogen poisoning, all before he would be integrated back into society. According to him, he attributes his survival to nothing short of being a miracle, and I'm inclined to believe him. Amanda Berry, Michelle Knight, and Gina DeJesus. The disappearance of 3 young girls in Cleveland, Ohio would rock the city as efforts to locate them became futile. Police had reason to believe that they'd been abducted and taken out of the state by their captors, but little did they know that all 3 girls had not only not left Cleveland, but were being held captive in a basement in a rundown neighborhood not too far from where they'd been abducted. Local school bus driver Ariel Castro lived in a creepy rundown house, which neighbors complained of hearing strange noises from. On more than one occasion, the police would be alerted, and although they had arrived at the scene, they never actually went inside, as they never had probable cause to get a warrant. But had they entered the home, they would have found that Castro had 3 prisoners locked in his basement. Castro had abducted the girls over the years on 3 different occasions. First, Amanda Berry would be taken in 2002, followed by Michelle Knight in 2003, and then Gina DeJesus in 2004. Castro had kept all 3 women chained up and locked in a room with no light, repeatedly abusing them, and then left them half-starved. As a result, one of his prisoners, Amanda Berry, actually gave birth to a child in 2006, 4 years after beginning captivity. All 3 women remained his prisoners for over 10 years, until one day in 2013 when he forgot to lock the door. Amanda Berry would manage to escape with her 6-year-old daughter to a neighbor's house, where they then contacted the police. The police were able to rescue the other women, and they arrested Castro when he returned home. Ariel Castro would be charged for over 900 counts of abduction, molestation, and aggravated assault, which would land him life sentence plus 1,000 years without the possibility of parole. He died by hanging himself barely a year into his sentence. Julian Hernandez. Julian Hernandez had no idea that he was a victim of a kidnapping until he tried to apply for his university paperwork. Attempting to apply for a scholarship, he then realized that his name did not match his social security number, and with the help of a guidance counselor, he discovered that his name was listed on the National Registry of Missing Persons. It turns out that Hernandez was kidnapped by his own father when he was barely 5 years old in 2002. His father, Bobby Hernandez, had lost custody of his son, but against court orders, kidnapped the 5-year-old boy, changed both of their names and social security numbers, and then started over in a different state. For 13 years, he lived undisturbed while his mother embarked on a decade-long search for her missing child. Bobby Hernandez would be arrested and charged with kidnapping and abduction, facing prison time. But while his mother was glad that her son was alive and well, Julian would be devastated by the revelation, but still pleaded with the judge for leniency as Hernandez was still his father and had not abused him in any way. He stated that his father was the biggest motivator, and although he had broken the law, he was still a good person and was very good to him all of those years. Bobby Hernandez would be sentenced to 4 years in prison after pleading guilty to all the charges that were laid against him. Petra Pasitka. 24-year-old student Petra Pasitka had gone missing in 1984 from Braunschweig, Germany. Petra had gone to the dentist, but then never returned home. Her family reported her missing, and police would suspect homicide, which resulted in a massive search for her, and the case would even be featured on a German true crime show. In 1987, the police identified a suspect referred to as Gunter K., who confessed to killing her, and although he withdrew his statement saying that he never actually killed her, that did very little for the case, as Petra was still missing. 6 years after being reported missing, she was declared dead in 1989, and her family had largely accepted that she was gone now forever. That was until 2015, when a woman named Dusseldorf reported that her apartment had been broken into, but when asked to produce a valid ID, the lady was unable to, and confessed to being Petra, who had been missing for almost 30 years. Apparently, she had managed to live under the radar by never getting a driver's license, a social security card, or even opening a bank account. Now, police had revealed that she couldn't be charged with a crime as she never tried to impersonate anyone or use any kind of false documents, and she also told the police that she didn't want to be found and had no interest in revealing her whereabouts to her family or the public. Bo Bergdahl. A U.S. soldier named Bo Bergdahl went missing without a trace in Afghanistan on June the 30th of 2009. He would be designated missing in action until it would be discovered in 2014 that Bergdahl was actually a prisoner of war and being held in a Taliban prison camp. Then President Barack Obama was able to negotiate his release in exchange for 3 Taliban prisoners that were being held at Guantanamo Bay. His release became highly controversial as it was discovered he actually deserted his post against all orders. He attempted to trek over to another base to report how poorly that his base was being operated, but was captured along the way and remained in a Taliban prison for 5 years. Upon his return, Bergdahl did not receive a hero's welcome, but instead would be charged with desertion, for which he pleaded guilty. He was given a dishonorable discharge, a fine of $1,000, and a reduction in rank from sergeant to private.